G'day guys! We have finally got the full core rules for 10th edition Warhammer 40k in our hands. We've had bits and pieces drip fed to us over the last couple of months, but we now have all of the rules from the Leviathan launch set, which is going to contain all of the rules for 40k in 10th edition. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through them with you, and I'm going to highlight some of the key changes between 9th edition and 10th edition. So if you're just coming over from playing 9th edition, this video is going to contain pretty much all you need to know in order to get started with 10th edition and what some of those major changes are, as well as some key strategies and tactics that you can use that these new rules permit that you couldn't have done in the previous rule set. So keep an eye out for those, and let's get stuck into the video.
Slog for the Blood God.
Alrighty, the first rule change that we've seen is the way unit coherency works in 10th edition. Now, models in units containing 6 models or less must be within 2 inches of a single model, while models in units containing 7 or more models must be within 2 inches of 2 models. We can still create triangles at the end of long chains, however be careful when removing casualties, as if you break these triangles, you can cause a chain reaction of removing models to regain coherency. So this sounds like a relatively small change on face value. It's just that we go from having a requirement of 6 models per unit to have 2 in coherency to having 7. So it's not that big of a change. However, it is going to mean that those 6-man units gain significant value as they don't get hit by the blast rule as easily as they do in 9th edition, and they're going to be able to do more impact, get more utility out of stratagems, those sorts of things. And it also means that we can still keep our coherency chains where you create 2 triangles at the end and string the models together. Just be careful though, because when you stuff casualties, if you remove them in such a way that you are no longer in coherency, at the end of the turn, you have to keep removing models until you regain coherency. So this can be a really interesting way that you can stretch your units out over large distances. However, there are drawbacks to be considered. Alright, next we have some changes to the movement phase. So models can now move over friendly units as if they were not there, so you no longer block yourself. Monsters and vehicles, however, cannot move over the top of other friendly monsters and vehicles. Non-monsters and vehicles can move over the top of monsters and vehicles and vice versa as if they were not there. And Desperate Breakout is no longer a stratagem. You can fall back over enemy models, but on a roll of a d6, for every model that does so, on a roll of a 1 or a 2, they die, excluding Titanic or Fly. So these are quite a few big impacts. It means now you can move directly through your own models as if they weren't there, which means you can place units in certain positions that you want to hold, and then you can move around them without having to worry about it. You can just go straight through. In addition to that, Desperate Breakout no longer being a stratagem means you can do it on multiple units in a single turn, whereas previously it was locked to 1 per phase. And it also means that it's going to be very, very difficult for your opponent to tag you. However, we will talk about some of the drawbacks of this when we get into the Battle Shock step. Alright, Battle Shock. Now, every unit that is below half strength in your command phase must take a Battle Shock test. This includes single model units with less than half of their wounds remaining. Units with small starting strengths are now more vulnerable to what we would have previously referred to as morale. A failed Battle Shock check means that you have an OC of 0, you can't use any stratagems on that unit, and if they fall back, they die on a roll of a 1 or a 2. This is particularly interesting if you can tag and wound multiple vehicles, get them below half strength, and then watch 1/3 of them pop if they try to fall back. Alright, so this is a new way of doing morale in 10th edition, and it's quite interesting in that now it's below half strength. So it used to be the number of casualties you suffered, you then added that to your roll and you were affected in that way, which often meant that small 5-man squads were immune to morale because they would have had to have been wiped out before they would get to a point where they would trigger a morale check. Whereas now, if you have a 5-man unit and you kill 3 of them and there's only 2 left, those 2 will have to take a Battle Shock check every single command phase and risk being objective control 0, and risk not being able to use stratagems on them, which is going to make it really, really interesting. It's going to mean that those small units running around are less impactful, and it also means that those small units of 5 are less immune and less invulnerable to those effects of morale, and those bigger units are potentially less vulnerable to those effects of morale. Also, interestingly, if a Battle Shock unit falls back, it has to take a Desperate Breakout check and if they roll a 1 or a 2, that model is dead. So interesting, particularly on single model units where they go, cool, I'm a vehicle with 10 wounds, somebody's put me down to 4 wounds left, so I'm now below half strength, have to take my battle shock check. If I fail it, then when that vehicle goes to fall back, they're going to risk on a 1 or a 2 just dying. So a common strategy I think we're going to see is if your opponent has multiple vehicles, you want to shoot a couple of them to soften them up, get them below half strength, charge a couple of them to soften them up, get them below half strength, and then try to tag as many of them as you can, so that in your opponent's turn, if they want to shoot that unit, they're going to have to fall back, and when they fall back, they're going to suffer battle shock checks and probably die. There's been some interesting changes to transports as well. As most of you probably already know, you can disembark after a transport has moved. The firing deck allows occupants to shoot out. Models in destroyed transports suffer a mortal wound on a roll of 1 instead of being destroyed. This is great for things like Terminators and multi-wound characters. Models disembarking from transports are automatically battle shocked. And emergency disembark is no longer a stratagem. Now it is not possible to set up within 3 inches, you can set up within 6, but take a mortal wound on a roll of a 1, 2, or a 3. Alright, so there's a few things to note there. One of them is that previously it was really risky putting expensive models like Terminators or characters in a transport, because if it explodes, you roll a dice on a roll of a 1, that model is destroyed. Whereas now they just take a mortal wound, which means if you have 10 Terminators inside of a transport or even 5 Terminators inside of something like a Land Raider, and that Land Raider explodes, you're going to roll 5 dice. For every 1, you're going to suffer a mortal wound. The probability of you losing a Terminator is very low. Or if you have a transport with multiple characters inside of it, you're very unlikely to lose those characters when that transport explodes. Further to this, the emergency disembarkation is now no longer a stratagem, it's just a rule. Whereas previously what people would do is they would throw transports forward so that they're 6 inches away from an objective, and then when your opponent blows up the transport, you'd emergency disembark and launch your models out onto the objective. Whereas now, you can only do that if it's not possible to place them within 3. So if you can place them within 3, you must. If you can't, you then can place them within 6. An interesting strategy that we could use here to retain that similar feel of what we used to do is take your transport, wrap it in something like cultists or some kind of cheap troop, so that when they blow up the transport, you actually can't place the models out, in which case you could then place them out 6 inches away. So there's still some interesting play there, but we're going to have to change the way that we approach it. Also worth noting that you can now do this to multiple things in a single phase in the same way that you could use the Desperate Breakout. You can now emergency disembark on multiple vehicles in the same shooting phase. Alright, some changes to the shooting phase. Vehicles and monsters can shoot and be shot at even within engagement range. Vehicles can shoot the unit that they're engaged with, and if your opponent charges into a vehicle, you can shoot it with other units without needing to fall back with the unit they charged. Tagging enemy vehicles can protect you, as enemies cannot shoot you, and if the vehicle's fall back move goes over a model, or that vehicle fails a battle shock check, it risks failing its Desperate Breakout roll and being removed as a casualty. So being able to shoot vehicles while they're engaged in combat, or shoot if you're a vehicle that is engaged in combat, is going to make vehicles shooting very, very interesting. However, it is going to mean that the people can't protect their vehicles by charging them into units and forcing your opponent to fall back in order to shoot you. They're just going to be able to shoot you regardless. So it's a bit take it or leave it, you know, like it's a little bit better but a little bit worse, but it's definitely interesting and is going to have impacts on the way the game plays. It is worth noting, however, that if that fallback move that a vehicle makes goes over one of your models, or if they had failed a battle shock check and therefore would require a Desperate Breakout, they risk rolling a 1 or a 2 and being removed as a casualty. Alright, we've got some really big changes to the charge and the fight phase. So charges are still deemed successful if you can make engagement range and remaining coherency. However, when moving models, if that model can end in base-to-base contact while maintaining coherency, it must do so. Enemy units that have fights first will fight before units that charged, as now the players whose turn is not taking place always select the sequence of fights. Pile-in moves must end in base-to-base if possible. You no longer have to declare a unit as the target of a charge in order to be able to allocate attacks to them, but you must be within engagement range after your pile-in. Models can make attacks if they are within engagement range or within base-to-base of a model that is also within base-to-base of the target. Consolidation moves can only be done if you can end within engagement range of an enemy unit. If they can't end within engagement range, they can then go towards the nearest objective marker, but must end on it. If they cannot do either, then they cannot make a move. So some really interesting ones there. Being forced to end within base-to-base contact where possible is going to make pulling off tricks like pinning very difficult, and it's also going to make things like stringing out onto objectives very difficult. Previously, a very common strategy was you would charge a unit so that you could use that charge move to get around and onto an objective over here, whereas now, if that move was sufficient to get within base-to-base contact, you must do so. There will be some interesting tricks with being able to use some of your models to block the movement of other models by making it so that they can't end within base contact, which will free up their movement to do these sort of swing moves, but it's going to be a lot more difficult than it was previously. Further to that, consolidates and pile-ins also must end within base contact and must end within engagement range, which is going to make using those moves to get extra distance on the table very difficult as well. Alright, there's some really interesting stratagems. Here are some of the takeaways for me. Insane Bravery is now used after you fail a morale check, allowing you to test your luck first before you use this, and if you fail, it's a huge improvement. Tank Shock allows you to really dial up the damage, particularly on combat-oriented vehicles. A Chaos Knight, for example, rolls 22d6, and for every 5+, the target suffers a mortal wound to a maximum of 6, and any strength 16 or higher vehicle is likely to do a reliable 6 mortal wounds on the charge. Rapid Ingress is probably my favorite thing in 10th edition. Deep strike somewhere safe in your opponent's turn, then move in your turn, and then charge with ease. Firing Overwatch can now be done in the movement phase. This makes big units of flavors terrifying. I'm looking at you, Rubric Marines, that can turn off saving throws. This also means no more use of a Rhino to absorb Overwatch, as they can hit you when you disembark in the movement phase, so using line of sight to protect yourself is critical. Smokescreen now provides the benefits of cover and stealth, so +1 to save and -1 to be hit. And Heroic Intervention is no longer linked to characters. Now any unit can do it, except for non-walker vehicles, and it's 6 inches instead of 3 inches. This is huge for objective control and heavy combat armies. It's also worth noting that most armies are going to be starting with 0 command points, so these stratagems, whilst very powerful and some very interesting stuff in there, they are going to be very limited in what they use. You will still generate one at the start of your turn and one at the start of your opponent's turn in the command phase, so you will have access to them throughout the game, but it's not going to be like previous editions where you start with a large pool of CP that you can then budget on how you're going to spend them throughout the game. You're going to have to budget them based on an income as opposed to a starting salary of command points. I personally think that the Rapid Ingress is the best stratagem, and it's going to be so much fun to use. Being able to wait until the end of your opponent's movement phase, figure out where they've moved all their models, and then go, cool, you've left a hole over here where you won't be able to shoot me, so I'm going to bring in my Exalted 8-bound into that little nook. Your opponent's not able to shoot you, and they can't move again because it's the end of the movement phase. So then in your turn, you're going to be like, cool, now I move out and then charge you. That's going to be so powerful, and I'm probably going to be spamming that Rapid Ingress every turn. I think that's going to be a ton of fun. But yeah, there's some really interesting stratagems, Heroic Interventions for all. That's going to make objective control really interesting. There's a few bits and pieces in there that are definitely going to make for a very interesting addition. All right, we have a new set of rules for reserves. So you're no longer restricted based on power level or number of units. Now it is just 25% of the points or less can be in strategic reserves. Not all reinforcement units are considered strategic reserves. Deep strike units are not limited by the strategic reserve restrictions, meaning turn 1 alpha strikes are back with deep striking units. And currently, there is no limit on strategic reserves arriving in turns 4 and 5, so late game objective grabbers are also back. Players no longer have dedicated battlefield edges, so for reinforcements, meaning you can come in from any table edge, but never within 9 inches. Alright, so these are some really big changes, and it is entirely possible that some of these may change again in the chapter-approved mission pack that may have additional restrictions on the way that reserves are used, but as it stands now, there's nothing preventing you from deep striking your Terminators turn 1, there's nothing preventing you from holding them back until turn 4 and 5, you can put your small squishy units like your cultists in strategic reserves and bring them on turn 4 or 5 when your opponent's firepower has largely been mitigated. Some really interesting stuff that you can do there. Also, interestingly, with strategic reserves, now there's no mention of your battlefield edge or your opponent's, which means you're no longer prevented from coming on from their battlefield edge, which is a bonus, but you can no longer come on within your battlefield edge and within your deployment zone within 1 inch of enemy units. You now have got that 9-inch restriction no matter where you go, no matter what you do. Alright, benefits of cover and terrain. So terrain now grants +1 to armor saving throws unless the attack is AP 0 and the target has a 3+ save or better. And if a model is not fully visible to every model in the attacking unit, and terrain is what's causing the obscuration, that model gains the benefit of cover. So that tank 43 inches away that is partially obscured to one of the bolter marines in your unit because of a statue means that that same vehicle gets cover against the las cannon in that unit, even if it is fully visible to the bloke with the las cannon. So this is really important, and this carries across multiple of the different types of terrain, where basically you measure your line of sight from the entire unit. And if the target is even partially obscured to one model in that unit, that target gains the benefits of cover. So units where there's one special weapon in the unit and the rest of them are all prattle small guns, you want to make sure that that unit's clustered up as tightly as possible, because the last thing you want to do is have a situation where one of those bolters that can't even draw range to the target happens to be obscured from a field of view, which is going to give your opponent cover saves against your big weapons. This is a real problem. Alright, so here are some of the different types of terrain. We've got craters. These are not particularly interesting. If an infantry model is wholly within it, it gains the benefits of cover. We've got barricades. You cannot end a move on top of them, and units can fight within 2 inches of the barricade. Interestingly, this means that you could fight but not be within engagement range, so no need to fall back after the fight is over. And they only provide cover to infantry models that are wholly within 3 inches. Then we have battlefield debris. You cannot end on top of it, but it provides cover to any model that is partially obscured by it. Then you've got hills, containers, and sealed buildings. These are just like battlefield debris, but you can stand on top of them. Then we've got woods. Models inside or on the other side of woods are never fully visible and thus gain the benefits of cover. And we have ruins. Models on a level 6 inches or higher, when shooting at targets on the ground, gain +1 AP. I guess that's gravity. Infantry and beasts can move through, and infantry, beasts, and fly can move through and up onto the upper levels. Models cannot see through or over the terrain, but can see into it. And towering and aircraft models can be seen and see over and through, and then all models that are partially obscured gain the benefits of cover. Alright, so this is really interesting, particularly the way that these towering models are able to see essentially through the terrain, which means if you've got a table that's got a whole bunch of buildings with windows in them, those big knights essentially can see the whole board. You can't hide from them, and that's going to be particularly scary. However, inversely, they can't hide either. So it's going to be really bloody games when you've got those big towering models. But the main takeaway that I think 10th edition is that almost everything is going to be receiving the benefits of cover almost all of the time, based on the way that these rules are written. So it's going to be very, very hard to put yourself in a position where you're going to be able to see your opponent and have them not receiving the benefits of cover, which means not only are we seeing a decreased AP level in most weapons in the game, but we're seeing increased saves in the form of cover. So vehicles in particular, which didn't previously get any benefits of cover, are going to be really loving this, and they're going to be very hard to take down with shooting. Alright, we've got some interesting stuff here about aircraft. Aircraft must be placed into strategic reserves, which limits you to 25% of your force, and you have to wait to use them in turn 2 onwards. You can't use them turn 1. Unless, however, they have the hover keyword, in which case they lose all aircraft rules and deploy normally. If they don't have the hover keyword, they must move more than 20 inches in a straight line first, then pivot. This means that you'll know what direction aircraft must move in your turn before they get their turn, based on which way they are facing. If you block their move, they must go back into strategic reserves. So previously the way it worked is you used to be able to pivot, then move, and then in your next turn you'd pivot and then move, whereas now it's the other way around. So when your opponent deploys their vehicle, when they come in on that turn 2, their flyer, they come in, they're going to have to come in facing a particular position, and then you know which direction is straightforward. So you can place models along that line, preventing them from actually being able to finish their move on the table, forcing them to fly off. And also, if your opponent goes first and they come down and you're not able to block them on that turn, when they move, they then have to pivot and create a new line, and you know the direction that that flyer is going to head in its next turn. So flyers are actually really, really predictable, and they're going to be very difficult to wield. However, if you do have a flyer that has the hover keyword, you can declare at the start of the game that it's going to hover instead, and then you can deploy it and run it as normal, and makes it a lot easier to use, but you do lose some of the keywords. Alright, so unless it changes in chapter approved mission pack, we have a few interesting changes to the missions. One of them is that if one player is left with no models left on the table, the game ends. So that way, if they have any units left in reserve and you kill what they have on the table, it's game over. And further to this, if the game ends in that manner, the player who has models left on the table is automatically the victor, regardless of points. Alright, so this means that the go hard or go home strategy is very, very viable in 10th edition. Basically, if you're able to table your opponent, you just win. It doesn't matter what the scores are, it doesn't matter how many victory points or objectives you control, it's game over, you win. This also means that armies like Grey Knights, with their ability to take units, put them back into strategic reserves, or things like Flyers where they can fly off the table and go into strategic reserves, are actually quite vulnerable, because if they do that, they're going to have less on the table, which is going to increase the probability of you tabling them, and therefore winning the game by wipeout. So I think 10th edition is probably going to have a lot higher durability across the board and make these things a lot harder. However, we're yet to fully see the way that this is going to work in terms of power and damage capacity, so it's worth noting that currently, as per the missions, if you get wiped out, it's game over, you lose. Alrighty guys, that more or less summarizes all of the important changes that I was able to note when going through this new 10th edition book. I've put some screenshots up there, so feel free to grab those, and let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you like this new edition? Are you excited? Are you pumped up? Do you think these rules changes are good? Or do you think some of these rules changes are kind of unnecessary, kind of clunky, and not really becoming of what we would have expected from 10th edition? Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. I look forward to having the conversation with you guys down there, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Look for the Blood God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.